Hello, everybody, and welcome to Rio 2016, COVID 2020, lessons learned and to be learned. We have with us today Doug Samuelson, who has been the president and chief scientist of his own consulting company, InfoLogic Inc., here in Annandale, Virginia, for 33 years. He has been a federal policy analyst, consultant, successful high-tech entrepreneur, executive, patented inventor, and adjunct faculty and research faculty at several universities. He is a well-known and most prolific columnist and feature writer for the OR Professions trade magazines, OR M&S Today, and Analytics. He has almost 300 publications. His consulting and research focus is on risk-advised decision-making, machine learning, cybersecurity, wargaming, healthcare policy, and disaster response and preparedness. He was recently presented an Alfred Nelson Marquis Lifetime Achievement Award by Marquis Who's Who. He holds a doctorate in operations research from the George Washington University and a BA in statistics from the University of California, Berkeley. With that, I'll welcome him to speak on this very timely topic. Doug, over to you.
Thank you very much. And let's see, you've got my title slide. Can you make this a full show? Okay, if that's the best we can do, that's what we'll do. There was a book by Laurie Garrett in 1994 called The Coming Plague, Newly Emergent Diseases in a World Out of Balance. She talked then about risk factors that indicated we might be headed for a sequence of major epidemics with possibly disastrous consequences. We've got mutating organisms. We've got misuse of antibiotics, which promotes resistant microbes. Humans are encroaching into isolated areas. That's part of how we got Ebola. It's also part of how we got HIV. People move into areas where they haven't been and they get exposed to viruses that we haven't dealt with, and we're just fresh meat for those bugs. We must have much faster transmission now because of fast global travel. Instead of an epidemic taking weeks or months to circle the globe, it can do it in 48 hours. We have distortion of resources by focused programs. If you really focus heavily on dealing with HIV in Central Africa and suck all the good nurses out of the clinics, you have a spike in malaria. And we have resources being stretched thinner and over-optimized throughout the world, developed and developing world. Next slide. The most potent kinds of biological threats would be, first of all, easily spread human to human. They would affect more diverse and less vocal subpopulations. We tend to notice them more slowly if, quite frankly, they affect people we don't notice as much or don't care about as much. There's no subpopulation with much faster spread than the others, so you sort of see a pattern and say, oh, gee, this is hitting mostly black men, this is hitting mostly Asian women, something's going on. And they cause complications that are less rare. Ebola is actually a very deadly disease, but it's also quite obvious. And you know right away if somebody near you is infected with Ebola, and your natural instinct is to run away. These are all pluses in terms of containing spread. If it causes coughing and sneezing and shortness of breath, there are 30 or 40 things out there that can do that. And it might take us a long time to figure out, no, this is a new infection and it's much more serious than colds and flu. It caused problems more like other ailments. Again, it gave me a stomach ache. Well, lots of things give you a stomach ache. It's a lot easier to diagnose something if it causes an unusual symptom like loss of taste and smell. If there are interactions with other conditions and risk factors, that makes the threat bigger. So if, for example, people with certain allergies are more likely to react very badly to this infection, in the places where those allergens circulate, that adds to the threat. When it causes a condition that's hard to treat without adverse effects, that's difficult. It's not only difficult to treat, it also confounds diagnosis, because if you're going to have to put a tube down somebody's throat, for example, or put them on a ventilator. People don't like that. They don't want to do that. They don't want that done to their loved ones. So they kind of tend to hold off. Let's make really sure that I'm sick enough to need that before getting treatment. And that accelerates spread. And if it requires an intervention that violates social norms, that's a big problem. Think about HIV, AIDS, and the tremendous flack that Dr. Koop, the Surgeon General, took just for putting out a very clear brochure about here's how it's spread and here's what you do about that. Oh, you're giving encouragement to people doing sexual practices we don't approve of. There were people calling for his job for having put out that brochure. And his response was, I'm a doctor. I try to treat people. I don't care about moral issues. I'm a doctor. I try to save lives. But where you're violating social norms, or for example, when you're telling the gay community that you need to close down all the bathhouses because those are your spread vectors, that makes it a more potent threat. You run into resistance to taking appropriate public health measures. Next slide. In 1918, the deadliest epidemic outbreak in history occurred. The 1918 influenza pandemic caused more deaths than the Black Plague in 1348. But because there was a much larger population in 1918, the percentage is lower. The flu pandemic killed more people in 4 months than World War I did in 4 years. And that's only about 7% lethal, and it killed about 50 million people. We don't know the number. Nobody knows the number. There's no way to know the number. We'll come back to that. The H5N1 bird flu that hit us in the late aughts, 2008, 2009, was about 50% lethal. Fortunately, it was not human-to-human infectious. But there were a couple of bright young, I don't know if they were young, bright researchers who submitted to the New England Journal of Medicine an article showing how to weaponize it and make it highly communicable. Thank goodness one of the referees caught that and said, okay, it's good that they gave us this evidence, so we believe them. We don't want to publish this. Next slide. That's how close we came. And we've come close a lot of times. That 2009-2010 H1N1 flu, there were 65 to 82 million people infected in the US alone. It was low lethality. Now that variation, that number I just gave you, is the best CDC estimate after the fact, well after the fact, of the number infected. That's a lot of variation. That should tell you something about how well this was tracked and controlled. We really literally don't know to the nearest 10 million how many people were infected. If that had 7% lethality, as the 1918 flu did, we'd have had 5 million dead in this country. If it had 30% lethality, we'd have had 20 million. The government would have fallen. Next slide. So now we were coming up to the 2016 Olympics, the perfect storm. We've got a lot of people in a small area, a lot of mingling. August is peak flu season there. Remember, that's Southern Hemisphere. You've got something like 500,000 spectators from all over the world gathering in this place, 10,500 athletes from 206 countries, plus support personnel. Some teams bring 5 people, a couple of trainers and a doctor. Some bring 100. The U.S. brings something like 100. And then you have 200,000 volunteers and staff, and everybody's crammed into this one city. Next slide. Where you have some very high-priced lodging areas surrounded by slums. You have limited medical and emergency response facilities. Brazil has very porous borders and traditionally a very lax attitude about international travelers. They had a big economic downturn the previous few years because the oil price dropped. And their the strong economy that gave them reason to think they could do an Olympics was based on oil. Well, price goes in half and bad things happen in an oil-driven economy. Considerable political division and instability, and that's putting it mildly. They were in the middle of impeaching their president for corruption at the time of the Olympics. Next slide. So you've got political instability, you've got a place whose infrastructure can barely support its population, absorbing 500,000 additional people, or 750,000 additional people. Now you think about influenza a little more. In 2003, we had the first SARS epidemic. The only place it got to in North America was Toronto. The World Health Organization promptly imposed a major quarantine on Toronto over strenuous protests from the Canadians. This is an overreaction. It isn't that big a deal. You're hurting our trade. You're hurting our business. You're hurting our reputation. Now, let me tell you a few things about influenza. Maybe you don't know this. Influenza precipitates mood disorder, especially depression. Precipitates is a professional term, means that it causes it. Potentiates would mean that it, or aggravates would mean that if it's there, this makes it worse. This precipitates it. The diagnostic manuals on depression tell the treater, provider, there's a whole list of things you run through and screen for before you can diagnose depression, and one of them is influenza in the last 2 weeks. This stuff will precipitate it, and you don't want to treat it as depression until you made sure that it isn't just that. In 2015, we had a MERS outbreak in Seoul, Korea. That started in the Middle East. There were 186 cases. It was pretty bad. It was about 35% lethal. One person, one of the people who died, was the doctor who brought it back from a medical conference on infectious diseases in Egypt. Virtually all the others were hospital transmissions. In South Korea, if somebody gets sick, the whole family goes with them to the emergency room and stays with them to provide emotional support and whatever aid they might need. So they're in prolonged contact with a lot of touching. The way they ended the outbreak was to close their 2 biggest emergency departments, because those were the spread vectors. Next slide. By the way, they were all running around with masks the whole time, and the main thing that did was deprive us guys of the enjoyment of seeing some good-looking women. The masks didn't do anything. And one of the reasons that there was resistance to the masking protocol for the current COVID-19 was people knew that masks don't always work. The first advice, you may recall, out of CDC was, don't worry about respiratory, worry about hands. Hands are the big transmission vector. Wash your hands, wash your hands, wash your hands again. Sanitize your hands. Don't touch anything that might be infected. Remember all that? We didn't come around to, oh, wait a minute, this is mostly respiratory transmission and we need to mask for a couple of months. Now, back to Rio. Crowded events, crowded housing. They had brought in a dozen cruise ships and parked them in port there as extra lodging. A cruise ship is just the perfect place to spread a respiratory disease because everybody's crammed together in fairly close quarters and it's limited ventilation. A lot of people would be riding mass transit. We were all packed together. They had would have overcrowded emergency rooms. So lots of places that something could have spread. Next slide. Effective response in Rio would be very difficult. There was very little time to import medical resources. They were short of the medical resources to deal with the crisis. Almost surely there would be no effective flu vaccine available. Those typically take about 6 months from identification of which viruses we want to include this year and actually building the vaccine and distributing it. Antivirals may or may not work. There are some flus that do respond to some antivirals. And if there's flu going around and you get to your doctor within 36 hours of onset, it's quite possible that he's got an antiviral, he or she I don't want to be sexist here, has an antiviral that will help you. But you can't count on that. Incubation for flu is typically like 5 to 7 days, depending on the strain. So if somebody did this deliberately and hit the Olympics about 4 or 5 days in, a lot of people would be into the second week and already headed home by the time the outbreak was identified. So the spread to the rest of the world could be very, very quick and very, very intense. Next slide. So you need extra medical personnel and resources. You need much extra treatment and bed space. You need a lot of temporary lodging for quarantine. And if effective medicines were available, it's better actually to distribute them to the people affected rather than having them come to emergency rooms or treatment centers. The CDC protocol typically for the cities where they've done experiments is they just leave it on a kiosk in front of the post offices. And you pick up pills, and we hope you can read and follow instructions. That's a lot better than having people congregate where they can affect each other. Next slide. There's an old story from the Talmud about how this one sage meets the angel of death on the road and asks, "Where are you going? What are you doing?" The angel of death says, "I'm going to that city you just came from, and I will slay 5,000 there." A month later, the rabbi runs into him again and says, "Liar, you slew 25,000. The angel of death says, "No, I slew 5,000 as I said. Panic slew the rest." Let's talk a little bit about secondary effects. Next slide. At something like the Olympics, you'd have a huge media presence, huge media outlets from all over the world, outlets far too numerous for the government to control if it knew how. In Brazil, believe me, it doesn't. The mentality for news media everywhere is if it bleeds, it leads. There's an incentive to compete in sensationalism. It's just the way it is, especially with TV. What'll put eyeballs on the screen? Oh, how about a fire? How about a wreck? And then you have the presidential political campaign nearing its peak in the US. Those politicians also have incentives to express strong opinions with, shall we say, little factual basis, especially the candidate from the challenging party wanting to criticize everything the incumbent party president did in response to this burgeoning crisis. So there's a lot going on here to direct public opinion away from a calm, reasoned, rational response into one or another form of mass reaction, either excessive reaction to it or excessive non-reaction. Oh, they'll be fine. It's just a bad flu. Flus don't kill people, including flus. Logic goes out the window here. Next slide. So we did this as a war game for Moore's Symposium in 2016. Think for a moment, as a war game designer would, as a war game player might, what would you think would happen? Would you get a nice, smooth, coordinated response with governments working together, developed country governments pouring aid in just the right places, in the right ways, at the right time, and with the full cooperation of the host government? If Chinese athletes started dying, there would be no recriminations toward the Americans about you guys started this, you guys didn't respond effectively, it's your fault. What would you think would happen? And of course, as a war game designer, I'm not that great a war game designer, I'm a super red player. I come up with all kinds of diabolical stuff, and I did. we had all kinds of stuff built into that game, most of which we didn't get to do because, as these things sometimes happen, I asked for 4 hours and wound up with an hour and a half. And we had to cut a lot of things out of the game because there just wasn't enough time to make the number of moves we wanted. I also had, very interestingly, and not that I didn't try, a heck of a time getting anyone to play Brazil. Remember what I told you about political divisions? I called the embassy, I called the military attaché, I called people in this country who were born in Brazil and now work in the US. Some of them are now US citizens. And almost unanimously, the reaction I got was, I know a little, but I would hate, even with 2 or 3 other people, to try to represent all the things that Brazil might do, which of course was one of the findings of the game, but it was also It's a finding going forward. If something big is happening in a developing country with an unstable political climate, it's going to be very hard, not only for a gamer, but anybody else to figure out what might happen. Next slide. So what did happen? Well, there was no mutant influenza or other major outbreak. After several months of congressional debate and reluctance, the U.S. devoted about half what the Brazilians had asked for 3 months late to combat and contain Zika, which looked like it might be a serious threat. And sure enough, we poured these resources in. There was some spread to the U.S., but not huge numbers. Didn't seem like any big deal to most of us, right? So that's containment success, right? Unfortunately, the difficulty of an online presentation like this is I can't read faces and see whether you're all sitting there nodding. Yeah, it was good. Oh, no, wait a minute. Do you think it was a containment success? Next slide. Within 2 months of the Olympics, Zika had spread to 47 states of the Union and Puerto Rico. It got 2 more states within the next few months. There were only about 5,500 cases, almost all traveler-borne. We got endemic hot zones in Puerto Rico, Brownsville, Texas area, Miami area, but 47 states. If that had been easily human-to-human transmissible, there's your next big epidemic outbreak. Our containment methods failed in 2016. Next slide. You may need to give it one more click. I'm missing one line there at the top. We have coming, thank you. So a highly transmissible, unusually lethal mutant flu or something like it at the Olympics, whether man-made or natural, could have been devastating. Speed and appropriateness of response is critical. We did have another Olympics coming up in South Korea, the Winter Olympics in February of 18. Remember, we had MERS there in 2015, so South Korea was pretty well prepared, but they were also kind of on edge about it, as were a lot of health experts. Then we had another World Cup coming up, and then there was another Summer Olympics. It was going to happen in Tokyo, 2020. Now it's moved to 2021. It's next month. The containment prospects are obviously much better than Rio. Tokyo is much better prepared to deal with something like this. But still, there is great concern about mutant COVID running amok next month in Tokyo. Many countries are electing to send only their teams and tell their spectators to stay home. Some countries are staying home. We've got some folks who know acting very anxious about this, and I think that's appropriate. It wouldn't be hard to start off another big epidemic. Next slide. Detection and effective response are cause-agnostic. Whether it's naturally caused or deliberately induced, once it gets started, they look very similar. It's important to do contact tracing in both cases because you want to know where it came from, not because you want to know whom to blame, but because you get more about what the epidemiology is and how it started and what you might have to do by way of intervention to contain it. No population group is negligible. Especially vulnerable population groups make the prospects worse and the response more complicated. If it's hitting cruise ship travelers, they have money. We know where they came from. We know where they were. They're vulnerable because they were on cruise ships. But other than that, they're actually easier to keep track of. Poor people in slums are much harder to track. They are more vulnerable. They're more prone to transmit. They're less likely to have good medical care. And it just gets a lot more complicated, especially if we're talking about the minority that's complaining about human rights abuses in a third world country with a government that's kind of leaning autocratic and maybe abusing to some extent the human rights of that minority population. Next slide. And then, of course, there are all these complicating factors that can occur with any epidemic. If you have environmental toxins out there, including some fairly low-profile stuff, That can change the effect of an infection. Some people have unusual adverse reactions to medication. We've had people react very badly to some of the COVID treatments. Prescription medication interactions and withdrawal are something we don't understand very well, we don't track very well. Even if there's no epidemic going on, we've got a lot of stuff going on with prescription meds, and especially with very strong psychotropics, where we do a lot of, US does a lot of testing on what happens when you administer a drug. And we track a lot of the effects of giving people a drug. We are much, much less diligent about what happens when you withdraw from a drug. Because you don't get a lot of withdrawal effects from antibiotics, and that's what we're used to. You do with psychotropics. Then there's this thing called the selfish biome in the biology world. Some microorganisms promote the growth of other organisms and degrade protective responses. HIV works by taking over and sabotaging the human immune system so that other things can come in that your immune system would usually stop, and they don't stop it. That's why so many people who have full-blown AIDS die of things like Kaposi sarcoma and pneumocystis pneumonia. Normally, an immune system would stop those, but one organism opens the path for another, and it takes a while for you to realize cause of death was pneumocystis pneumonia. Underlying cause was HIV. Next slide. My dad, don't go back. My dad had an ulcer, and he spent 30 years listening to "It's your lifestyle, stupid. It's your lifestyle, stupid. It's your lifestyle, stupid." All this stuff about diet and reducing stress to manage his ulcer. Then we found out about this thing called Helicobacter pylori, which, counter to anybody's intuition, likes to live in stomach acid. It likes it so much that it finds ways to signal the body, send me more of that stuff, that's good. There's an antibiotic that kills H. pylori, and if you take that antibiotic, you can go ahead and go back to any spicy food and alcohol you can otherwise tolerate without getting an ulcer, without aggravating an ulcer. That's an infectious disease. Who knew? So when we think about disease, we think about a biothreat, we have to think more broadly. We have to include these complex and combined attacks by multiple toxins and organisms, things that increase susceptibility to other hazards. We have to think about indirect attacks by some kind of organisms that change the biome. This is what many people think is going on with obesity, that there are some viruses out there that change the balance of bacteria in the stomach and the intestine, so you can't break down fat as well, and it winds up going on to you rather than out the usual outlets. Allergies and infections change the effects of vaccines. We have more allergies going on, we have more treatments of infections going on, and you may have seen all the cautions. If you got COVID vaccine, we don't want to give you this vaccine if you have had this, or this vaccination for something else in the last 2 weeks, because vaccinations activate the immune system, and we want your immune system to be activated in the way that the people we tested it on were. Next slide. One of the neglected vulnerable groups out there that we really ought to pay attention to are first responders and law enforcement. Blue canaries, higher exposure to infections and toxins. They would be the first people exposed to symptoms. They will also often be the first people to show symptoms. They could be specifically targeted in a deliberate attack. They're also exposed much more to traumatic events, and traumatic events change immune system response, among other things. And the problems in this group, of course, affect everybody else. People in these professions have a tendency to underreport their own discomfort, especially psychological discomfort. So it can take you a long time even to realize that they've been hit. And there they are. And it's one more thing to think about. Next slide. One more click, please. How would we know if somebody actually introduced a subtle, debilitating biological or chemical agent that changes mood? We know that both the US and the Soviet Union worked on agents like that since the 1950s. I mean, agents, things you could put into a cat that would make it run from a mouse. Big changes. How would we know? The only thing we could do is monitor social indicators. If we see murder rates, violent crime rates, suicide rates, illegal, dangerous drug use rates increasing sharply for a while, that would be an indicator that we're under attack, maybe. Certainly something to look at. Hey, wait a minute. All those indicators started increasing dramatically in this country in the mid-60s. We know that many soldiers returning from the Vietnam War had drug habits and good connections, and they'd gotten them on R&R in places like Hong Kong. Gee, you don't suppose some of that might have been part of a deliberate attack on the U.S., do you? Next slide. Once things start to happen, there's no time to identify sources and attack them. It's not very effective anyway. No, I don't care what they did in the movie Outbreak. That finding the monkey it started with doesn't help you. The only way it helps you is give you a better idea of what the organism is and how it works. The best defense is universal access to inexpensive in-system health care. Universal access to inexpensive in-system health care is not a privilege. It is not a right. That whole debate is a distraction. Universal access to inexpensive in-system health care, reporting to the national system, is a national security imperative. Community policing and readily available treatment seem to be much more effective than aggressive law enforcement against the drug trade. Often what happens with aggressive law enforcement is that law enforcement is being enlisted as an abettor, an enabler for the most powerful drug gang, cartel organization. You've got one big criminal organization that controls the drug trade, and the cops are driving all of their competitors out of business. That's not necessarily good for social policy either. Many, if not most, of the mass shootings we have seen in the last 20 years, I'll leave out this past year because I don't know what's going on the past year. But up to there, I did look at the data from a number of mass shootings from 2000 or so to the late 90s or so up through 2019, and almost the preponderance of them were people who had been on strong psychotropics, maybe court ordered. You want to stay out of inpatient treatment, you take outpatient treatment. And they were unmonitored. The court ordered it, but then nobody was checking to see whether they got off the med. And interesting things happen when you get off psychotropics unmonitored. Interesting things happen when you're monitored, but it gets a lot wilder if you're not. Next slide. So one of the most important things we can do is an international network of disease monitoring and early treatment sites. George W. Bush, after Hurricane Katrina, took a little sabbatical. And he read, I think it was Laurie Garrett's book. It might have been John Barry's 2005 book on the Great Influenza. And he said, oh, this is a real problem. This is a real threat, and there's something we can do about it. And he set up this international U.S. subsidized network of disease monitoring
Hey everybody, sorry about that. We have a couple of technical issues here, including I muted my mic to make this announcement. We're having a slight technical issue, I think, on Doug's end. We'll give him a moment to try to reconnect and see if he's able to rejoin us here. Just as a reminder, if you have questions for Doug, feel free to put them in the Discord, and we'll ask them when we get to the Q&A portion if we're able to resume the presentation.
Hi, I'm back. My computer crashed. No, I don't want that. God damn it. Motherfucker piece of shit. God.
Hey, everybody, just to give you a heads up where we're at, we've got Doug back on the line, and as soon as he's ready to go, we'll go ahead and pull him back into the stream, and we'll get started again. If you've got any questions, go ahead and put those into Discord. Otherwise, I'm going to pass it back over to Doug if he's ready. Thanks all. Really appreciate your patience.
The crash. I don't know what happened. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. You are ready to go. Go ahead.
Okay, well, George W. Bush decided to establish this network of monitoring and early treatment sites, mostly in the developing world. Obama expanded that. It was up to 47 sites. In 2018-19, President Trump decided to close most of those sites and cut the program funding quite substantially. The Scowcroft Institute at Texas A&M, which is nonpartisan, a very good think tank, put out a big report in early 2019 about comparative international readiness to deal with outbreaks. They said, and it's about 60 pages long, and they won't let you download it. You have to go. I've got a link in the references. You've got to go read it. But basically what they said was that international cooperative arrangements were key. Monitoring in poor and vulnerable regions was the best defense, so you catch these things early and jump on them early before they spread. You need planned, coordinated response. You need planned, coordinated communications to your citizenry about what's going on, so everybody's on the same page of the music and they trust what you tell them. Well, the U.S. did not follow its own plan. I'm not going to elaborate on that. You read the Scowcroft Institute plan, or you read the article I wrote for Global Peace Services in June, saying, in effect, what the plan was and letting people draw their own conclusions about whether we were following it. And you can draw your own conclusions. We pretty much shot ourselves in the private parts there. The Biden administration, to the best of my knowledge, they've been undoing a lot of the things that Trump did, but I have not heard any announcements about reopening that network. It may be that Biden doesn't want to, it requires an appropriation, and he doesn't want to confuse Congress with anything more than the bare minimum necessary at this time. And he'll bring it up later. I don't know. My reaction to all this is they would not listen. They did not know how. Perhaps they'll listen now. Next slide. Health preparation and response is a public good. It's like a park. It's like a military. Nobody can capture all the benefits of their actions, nor can they exclude others from the benefits if they build it. So we pool our resources through government, we share the costs, and we all reap the benefits. When President Trump decided to cut that network, he explained that he was a businessman, and in business you don't carry wasteful excess capacity. You run lean and buy what you need when you need it. That might work fairly well for construction projects. But when your city has too few fire engines, you can't just go out and buy one complete with a trained crew. That's a public good. And I think that a number of people did not understand that in the planning and preparation that were done in the last few years. Next slide. And this isn't a partisan political thing. This isn't a Trump thing. This is a general perception thing of, do we recognize what's good for us as a community, as a country? Bioattack, deliberate and natural, is here right now. We know that. Biological and chemical threats were emphasized in the national security strategy in 2018, but may have been downplayed somewhat when we actually confronted one. We need to rethink and develop an integrated response strategy, especially communications and emergency and disaster responses. The worst threats are going to be the ones we gloss over. We're all focused on Zika, and mutant flu sneaks up on us. Prescription medications are a huge problem. It happens every day, and it doesn't have a big dramatic effect, so we don't notice it. We need to rethink the appropriate balance of rights regarding things like guns, refusal of medical treatment, refusal of vaccination. There are decisions people want to make that affect the community at large. And next slide. Next slide. Now, good. Lord Acton, who got most famous, he was a historian, later got a title for his great contributions. Most famous for power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. He also said institutions tend to perish from an excess of whatever principle made them successful. One of the big principles that made the U.S. successful was individualism and the near supremacy of individual freedom. We may need to think about the extent to which we expect individualism to live within the rule of law and some general communitarian values. We've kind of gotten away from a lot of constraints we all kind of expected were there and assumed were there. And it's just, it might be time to look again at some of the balance of law, expectation, social custom that define who we are as a country. Microorganisms don't see boundaries, and they don't see Supreme Court decisions. Can we rebalance toward a more cooperative action nationally and globally? It's something we probably would do well to think about a lot. Next slide. Here's what I'm pretty sure about. John Wooden, great basketball coach, said to fail to prepare is to prepare to fail. David Ben-Gurion said the biggest threat to our security, he's talking about Israel, but it's anybody, is inertia in the thinking of those responsible for our security. We have to think more broadly and more creatively about how to counter the multiple growing threats of biological attack on the human species. And until we do, they would not listen, they're not listening still. Perhaps they never will. Next slide, references. Questions? Guess they all ran for cover. One of the very few times I've ever given a presentation I thought would be pretty controversial, left time for questions, didn't get any. Do we have a malfunction somewhere, Sean?
No, sir, no malfunction. I'm looking at the Discord room. If anybody has questions, now is a great time to go ahead and post those, and we'll get them in front of Doug, and we'll take it from there.
Did everybody bail out when the computer crashed?
No, sir. You still got 15 loyal followers.
How many did I have before the crash?
14.
Oh, well, that didn't hurt us. Somebody joined to see what the problem was. Okay, well, I'm probably standing between some people and dinner, so thank you very much. And I hope this was of value to somebody. It is recorded, so I guess if people want to review my rant some other time, they can. And thanks for your help, Sean. Or David, were you doing it? Maybe I'm thinking the wrong person. Well, whatever. Stop recording.